Today we got a project in the shop. It's wet and rainy outside in the backyard, so we're indoors today. This is a project on a 2008 Smart for Two, a little smart car, model 451, I think they call it. And what we have to do is replace the front springs. Apparently, these little smart cars are prone to breaking the front springs. And after having a look at it, it's not a wonder. The original spring, here's a replacement here, you can see. The wire diameter is 8 millimeter. Real numbers, that's about 5/16 of an inch, so not very substantial, really. And what happens, apparently, you can see that the spring is real small on this end, and then the coil expands out and then reduces in size again at the top or the other end, but not quite as much. So the larger small diameter is the top, and the smaller small diameter is the bottom. And what happens, and it wouldn't take a genius to figure out what's going on here, is as this spring transitions from this small diameter to the larger diameter, the spring breaks. Imagine that. One would think that some educated person would have figured that out before they ever made the car, but here are the pieces have already taken the springs out of the car and replaced one side. So here are the broken pieces from one side. You can see that it's just snapped right off, it's twisted, whatever, right in that transition point as that spring starts to increase its wire diameter. This is the other side. Same break, same sort of tear, just a little farther around the circumference of the spring. So, kind of looks like piss poor design to me. What do I know? I'm just a backyard sort of guy. But we've got new springs, and like I said, we replaced one already. This is a real PIA or PIB, however you want to define it, pain in the butt job. The hardest part is getting the top nut off that holds the top of the strut. When you get that out, the rest of it's pretty straightforward. What happens with these things is this bottom curl sits in a cup on the strut, and when that spring breaks right in here, this larger diameter of the spring falls down over the cup and lowers the front of your car about 1.5 inches or 2 inches, and effectively takes all the spring out of it. So now it's like solid suspension. It can go as far as to go down and rest on the sway bar link, and happens to both sides. So if you've got one of these older smart cars, odds are if you don't have broken springs yet, you're gonna have them. So we'll try to show you what we think is a good way to replace them. Everybody has a little bit different method, but we'll get into that here in the video in a little bit. What we did to make it a little easier to get the old springs out, I mean the spring's no good anyway, so we just took our death wheel and a little small death wheel and went in there and cut the spring into pieces. You got to be a little careful. Even with the front suspension hanging, there's a little bit of pressure on the shock, so you know you got to be a little careful in there with the death wheel. But once you cut that first coil, that's the end of it. And then we just cut the coil up into sections and twisted it right off around the strut so that we got the spring out of the way. And that just now, when we take the top nut off the strut, all we have to do is compress the strut and push down on the lower control arm and tilt the whole assembly out from under the car, and we'll show you that. So down in here you can see the plate and the nut right there that retain the top of the strut, and it's about a 13/16 socket will work on that. I don't know, it's 21 millimeter socket. And generally speaking, what happens is the top of that shaft is pretty rusty. You might find a dust cover on yours. We've been soaking that. The end of the shaft has a 7 millimeter Allen wrench opening punched in it, but the way things are now with the fenders and the headlight and everything in there, you'd be hard pressed to get your Allen wrench down in there and any kind of an open end wrench on that nut to get it loose. The other thing that you've got to do is you've got to hold the shaft of the strut from turning, so that's another problem all by itself. And we made a tool to help hold that shaft, and on the other side the tool needed some assistance, so we'll show you that tool here in a minute. One of the things you have to do in order to get these struts out from under the fender, in order to get the new springs on, is disconnect the sway bar links. This is the sway bar link in all its glory. You can see this one, we pulled the ball out of the socket and killed that one, so we're going to have to get a replacement. Moog makes a real good replacement for that, but hopefully what you got to do is get this nut off. And yeah, I love the way they design this stuff. Obviously the first time you put it together is no sweat. Next guy comes along, hadn't got a prayer. This is a T30 Torx that you got to put in there, and a 16 millimeter nut, oddball size. And essentially what you got to do is hold the nut and turn the Torx and unscrew that to get it apart. And if your nut is super duper tight, like most of them are, you're probably going to kill the Torx, twist it off or round this out before you get the whole thing loose. And in that case, you're just going to have to knock it apart and put your vice grips on the ball like we did on the other end of this, and throw this away and replace it with a new one. So just a piss poor design. All you have is a little plastic socket in there. It must be this deal that's pressed in there, and then the ball runs around in there, and there's no way to hold that ball from turning to unscrew the nut except for that Torx T30 down in the middle of that pin. So it's just another fun item in the middle of this job that makes it aggravating. And we made ourselves a tool to hold the strut rod to keep it from turning so that we could take the nut off the top. What we did was took some aluminum stock and bored an 18 millimeter hole in the center and then cut it in half. So we've got two halves of this clamshell, and we've got a couple of flats on the back here that we machined on. Essentially you put that around the shaft of the strut, and with this one we just clamp it with a vice grip. Hopefully that'll hold that shaft. On the other side it wasn't quite enough, and the shaft is polished, so it just turned inside here ever so much, and really we ended up putting another pair of vice grips at the very top of the shaft in order to keep the shaft from turning. Mercedes, I guess somebody makes a tool like this, a little more sophisticated. It's a little wider and has some bolts to hold the two halves together, and then what they do is they have a wrench that slides over that to hold it. But if the shaft wants to turn in there, There's nothing's going to keep it from turning in there. This is just aluminum, so the shaft will turn in there, and then you really have to go back and try to figure out how to get that nut off the top. Once you get the top nut off, you can compress the strut and get it out from under there, and there's a second nut down underneath, and those come off a lot easier than the top one. But we're going to try this on the other side. Maybe we'll get lucky and it'll hold the shaft enough for us to get that nut off. So now you can get a kind of view up in there on the underside. Obviously we've removed the coil spring. We've cut it out of there so it's not in the way. And we have our tool clamped around the shaft of the strut. Now I will say we did get the nut off the top. We had to take a second set of vice grips and all the way up here in our top clamp another set on there to really hold that shaft, and then we used the impact gun to buzz that nut off on the other side, and we got lucky and that nut came off. So now what we can do is just compress that strut. Take our tool off here first, and we should be able to compress that strut. Probably gonna have to push it down from the top. We'll push it down out of here and get it out in the open here. And then what we're gonna have to do is take the sway bar link off, probably the toe link, so we can, and take the brake caliper off so that we can pry this lower control arm down far enough to swing this whole assembly out from under the fender, put the new spring and everything on, and then get it back up under the car. So we'll show you that sway bar link in just a minute. So there's the bolt for the top sway bar link. Like I said, it takes a T30 in the center there, and then a hex wrench on the outside, a 16 millimeter. And you got to try to hold that T30 and turn that nut, and that could prove to be a little difficult. We'll have to try that and see what happens. So now you can see that we were able to disconnect the sway bar link. We disconnected the tie rod, took off the brake caliper, pushed the top of the strut down from up on top, and we managed to swing the whole adventure out from under the fender. So now it's outside the car. So what we got to do now, there's a nut here, in here, that we need to take off. And then underneath that is where our bearing is, so it allows the strut to rotate. This is the top hat for the spring and the bottom seat for the spring. So what we've got to do now is take that nut off, take all this off, take the top half off, put the spring on there, and then get a spring compressor, compress the spring down, and put this top hat back on, and put the whole adventure back up under the car. So this is the drill. We have the strut out from under the fender. We managed to get the top nut off. The top nut sits down in there like that. Underneath that is the bearing. Goes down in that pocket. Then you have the top hat for the spring, and that pushes against that bearing and allows the strut to rotate. And that all sits up on top of the spring. When the strut is back up under the car, it sits in a pocket, and the shaft comes up through the pocket, And then you have this plate that goes on top and that nut. And that's really what holds the whole thing together. So it's important to remember this bearing in here goes in between the rubber bushing and the top hat. And the top hat, the long tapered side goes up, if you want to call it that. The cup side goes down, and this sits on top of that like so. And what we're going to do now is compress the spring and see if we can get it all in there. So what we got here is the front spring. Got our spring compressor on there, and what we've got to do is compress these coils down, get the spring short enough that we can put it on the top of the strut and get the top hat on with the nut. Now you want to be careful doing this. Even this light spring has a lot of tension on it, and make sure that your tools are on there securely and they don't jump off. It could hurt you. So you want to be careful about it and methodical in your approach, and just sneak up on it and get the thing compressed far enough where it'll slip down over there, and then you can put the top plate on. And we'll work on getting this compressed, and then we'll see if we can get it on the strut. Well, we got the new spring on there finally, with the spring compressor and everything. One thing you need to be aware of is right here on the bottom seat on both sides there's a little nub, and that spring has to be on there so that the end of the spring is up against that nub. So when you're putting the spring on, make sure you get it rotated around so that the end of that spring butts right up against that little nub. And the trick now is going to be to get that lower control arm down low enough to get that whole package back up under the fender and up through the cowl and get the top nut on. We get a look here at the finished product. Got the spring up in there and got the nut on the top. Brake caliper back on, sway bar link hooked up. Everything back the way it's supposed to be. I guess we'll just have to keep an eye on this and see how long these new springs last. Hopefully they'll be better than the ones that were in there, but hard to tell.